Some interesting points there from number 10 in Derby, and no doubt shared by some of you watching this morning. And we're joined now by Carl Benfield, who's the Green Party's candidate for North West Leicestershire. He's a chartered engineer and a former army officer. Welcome to you, Carl.
Thanks, Mum.
So, Carl, a reminder there in our film that voters have more on their minds than just Brexit. We heard there that our region misses out on investment. Has your party got plans to spend more in this region when it comes to investment?
I think the issue that we've got is climate. I mean, this should be a climate election. We have an enormous plan to tackle climate change by spending £100 billion each year for 10 years, £1 trillion overall, to deal with the most pressing issue. You talk to people in this area, talk to people in Doncaster about what's important to them. Their houses are underwater. That's what we have to deal with. It's now a crisis.
Okay. We understand that is a top of the agenda as far as you're concerned, but your party is also against HS2.
Yes, well, HS2, we're not against big infrastructure projects.
That's important to people here in the East Midlands.
It's a project that will devastate the environment as it's being built. It's magically transformed from being something about speed to something about capacity just to justify it. And actually what we should be doing is spending that money on local transport links in order that people can get to and from work much more easily. HS2 is so London-centric. That's our issue with it.
Heather Wheeler, what do you make of £100 billion of investment when it comes to climate change every year?
Well, climate change is absolutely the number one priority. Equally, we want local infrastructure. So our announcement about getting rid of the beaching cuts and bringing in local trains prospects so that people can get to work. I mean, just doing all the incremental local infrastructure things is really important to the East Midlands. And certainly, you know, Derby, the railway centre, the capital, I think, not Doncaster and not Birmingham. I think Derby's the rail centre. So everything that we can do to have national infrastructure centred around the East Midlands, I think is an absolute winner.
Well, that sounds promising, but all the figures show that the East Midlands comes bottom when it comes to investment in this region, and your party's got to take some of the credit or blame for that.
Absolutely, but our first piece of this programme was about 33 marginal seats, so for goodness sakes, let's get those Conservative, and then we can have the infrastructure the East Midlands deserves.
Okay, well,
we'll have a louder voice.
Margaret Beckett, when Labour were last in power, a lot of the investment actually went to the north and not much of it was spent here in the East Midlands. Why would it be any different this time?
Because, well, for two reasons. First of all, because I think everybody recognises that we have to make now a considerable investment in infrastructure. And I was interested to hear Heather talk about undoing what Beeching did. It sometimes seems to me that the programme this election is to undo everything that previous Conservative governments have done. I remember standing outside the rail centre in Derby campaigning against Beeching. So yes, we've got to do that, but also what we've got to do is to listen much more and to give much more power and much more decision making to people in the localities, and not just do it, because that's where a lot of it goes wrong. With the best will in the world, people's intentions are good, but from Whitehall they don't always get the decisions right.
OK, Robert Swift, are the Liberal Democrats promising a big spending splurge here in the East Midlands?
Well, when I look at
so many promises around.
When I look at the 80 billion cost of HS2, I mean, even my eyes are watering. And we're pro high-speed rail, but for a fraction of that, you could have electrified the East Midlands main line. I mean, you look at the tram in Nottingham; it just misses out the east half of the city completely. I think if you want to attract big employers to the region, then you need skills, infrastructure, and access to key markets. And it's all of those three need to be employed together to bring major investment and major employers into the region.
OK, and Carl, how would your party's policies actually genuinely help the East Midlands? I mean, we heard about your policies on climate change, but for the East Midlands specifically?
Specifically, there is so much talent here in the East Midlands, and we're going to need that talent to deliver the Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal is based on, the concept is based on what happened in the 1930s in America. The economy was devastated, and Roosevelt decided he had to completely restructure what was going on. Now, the Green New Deal is really our moonshot. I mean, we've got 10 years to make a difference on climate change. This is a visionary project, and we hear the other parties talk about unifying the country again. We desperately need to do that. We need to do it around a central theme. Fixing climate change with £100 billion a year is just, it's a fantastic concept.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, while politicians came rushing up to the East Midlands this week, the rain came pouring down and flooding hit the headlines across the region. The Derwent burst its banks last weekend, causing floods everywhere from Matlock to Derby in the early part of the week. At the same time, North Nottinghamshire was hit hard too. In the past few days, Nottingham and many of the villages around it have suffered flash floods as heavy rain overwhelmed the drains, and communities in and around the River Soar between Loughborough and Leicester have also found themselves faced with flooding for the second time in recent months. Flooding, obviously we talk about climate change. What is the Green Party, Carl, going to do about flooding in the East Midlands to help people currently affected?
The immediate issue, of course, is trying to build flood defences. But the problem with flood defences are, once you've built them, the floods get higher, we then get inundation again. We need emergency services to deal with that. We've had the emergency services overstretched massively. And we have to look at the long-term issue is, rather than just dealing with, we're constantly dealing with the symptom of the problem rather than the cause of the problem. And that's going across the whole economy. We're looking at healthcare, we're looking at schooling, we're looking at the environment. We have to deal with the cause.
OK, well, Heather Wheeler, Jeremy Corbyn said that your government's response to the flooding in the East Midlands and South Yorkshire, of course, was woeful, in his words.
No, well, I think that's plain politics when people are at their lowest point. I think that's disgraceful. Obviously, I've got out and about and I've talked to folk about the situation in different villages where they've had flooding, and they've been overwhelmingly kind, certainly not been heckled, and equally there are local protections that we can put
Boris
in place,
Johnson
which
was
is
heckled,
much.
wasn't he?
Well, people are very, very angry, and you know, if you live in a bungalow and it's all gone, well, we completely understand. But that's why it's important. We've got the National Forest here in the East Midlands, which is so important, and the £650 million investment that we want to have in new trees, growing those, because that deals with the CO2 and it deals with soil protection, and it deals with making sure that people have a greener place to live, and that the huge investment that has been in businesses in the East Midlands, because it's a great place to live.
Margaret Beckett.
One of the biggest things, when David Cameron's government was first elected in 2015, I remember saying, 2010, I remember saying to my husband, oh no, this is, because one of the first big infrastructure cuts they made was in flood defences. And I remember saying then, because it had been the work of my department, and you had to have a long-term programme and build it up consistently. And of course the other thing we're seeing
That's a bit
is the
rich
emergency
when we spend
services.
goodness knows how much in Derby, Margaret. Come on.
It's not enough, Heather, as we have seen. But the other side of the coin is that the emergency services are no longer able to deal with it as well as they should be. They're doing wonders, but you know, they too are at risk. But the thing about floods is that you've got to have a long-term programme. You've got to look at all sides of it. You can't just defend with concrete. You've got to plan.
OK, well, your party, Robert Swift, was part of that coalition that made those cuts to work towards flood defences.
So you're not really going back to the coalition again, are you?
Why not?
Well, you were part of the coalition. That was the last time you were in government.
And we're responsible for climate change as well, are we? I mean, this is a
that's
global
not what I'm saying.
problem,
I think
Mari.
you're reading things into what I'm
If you get
saying.
extreme weather events and rising sea levels, flooding is going to become more and more common.
So how will you tackle it here in the East Midlands?
Well, it's a global problem. Look at what's just happened in
a
Venice.
global
They've had
problem.
their highest ever floods.
And look what's happening here in the East
We
Midlands.
have to meet our commitments to become a zero carbon economy. We want to do this by 2045. You do it not just by planting trees, and we want to plant 60 million trees a year, one for every person in the country. You can groan about it if you like.
2045 is too late. And you know, we have the other parties tinkering around the edges.
That's 5 years before our legal obligation.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you all, my guests today. And that's all for now. You can find out more details of who's standing and the party's policies on the BBC News website. There are also details of who's standing where you live on your local council's website. Thanks to all my guests. We'll be back next week. Goodbye.